Flight Sergeant Totaro Shimizu's hands tightened on the control stick of his Nakajima 84 as he climbed toward the bomber formation. The morning sky over Tokyo was crystal clear, and below him, the imperial city spread across the landscape like a living map of his homeland. He'd been scrambled dozens of times in recent months to intercept the massive B-29 superfortresses that had been terrorizing Japanese cities, and each time the ritual was the same. Climb hard, attack fast, and pray the bomber's defensive fire didn't tear you apart before you could line up a shot. But as Shimizu's fighter punched through a thin layer of cloud, what he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. There, weaving among the silver bombers like sharks in a school of whales, were single-engine fighters, not the stubby, slow Navy corsairs he'd encountered over the Pacific Islands. These were sleek, streamlined aircraft with distinctive scoop intakes beneath their noses and bubble canopies that gave their pilots perfect visibility in every direction. They were American P-51 Mustangs, and they were flying combat air patrol over Tokyo itself. Shimizu later wrote that his first thought was that he must be hallucinating from oxygen deprivation. His commanders had told him repeatedly, had sworn with absolute certainty that no American single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach the Japanese homeland from any Allied base. The distances were too vast, the fuel requirements impossible. The empire's mainland was protected by simple geography as much as by its defenders. Yet there they were, impossibly present in Japanese airspace, hunting with the casual confidence of aircraft that had fuel to spare, and pilots who knew they owned these skies. What Shimizu was witnessing in that crystalline April morning was the arrival of a weapon that would break not just Japanese air defenses, but the psychological certainty that had sustained Japan's military leadership through years of retreat and defeat. The sight of those Mustangs over Tokyo represented something more devastating than mere tactical defeat. It proved that Japan's last defensive barrier had been shattered. To understand why the appearance of American fighters over Tokyo was considered impossible, you need to know the strategic geography that had protected Japan for thousands of years. The Japanese home islands sit isolated in the western Pacific, separated from the Asian mainland by the Sea of Japan and from any significant Allied bases by hundreds of miles of open ocean. This natural moat had been Japan's greatest defensive asset throughout the war. Before we dive deeper into how this impossible moment happened and what it meant for the pilots on both sides, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Pacific Air War. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the P-51's role over Japan before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II history, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The mathematics of aerial warfare in the Pacific had always favored the defender. Fighter aircraft of the early war period typically had combat ranges measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. The famous Mitsubishi Zero, which had dominated the early years of the Pacific War, could fly approximately 800 miles in a straight line with drop tanks attached. That impressive range had allowed Japanese fighters to escort bombers across vast distances and appear over targets the Allies thought were safely beyond fighter range. But now the tables had turned dramatically. The Allies had captured Iwo Jima, a volcanic island that sat almost exactly halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo. The distance from Iwo Jima to the Japanese capital measured approximately 750 miles of open ocean. For every fighter type in service at the start of World War II, such a distance would have been completely beyond reach. Attempting such a flight would have meant running out of fuel and ditching in the Pacific with no hope of rescue. Japanese military planners understood these limitations intimately. They had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that American fighters simply could not reach Japanese airspace from any captured base. The B-29 superfortresses were a different problem. These massive strategic bombers had been specifically designed for extreme range missions, and their appearance over Japanese cities had become increasingly common throughout late 1944 and early 1945. But bombers without fighter escort were vulnerable to coordinated interception, and Japanese commanders believed they could inflict sufficient losses to make the bombing campaign unsustainable. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service maintained hundreds of fighters dedicated to homeland defense. These aircraft, flown by pilots who knew they were defending their families and their emperor, represented Japan's last line of aerial defense. They had been told by their commanders, by their technical experts, and by basic aeronautical mathematics that they would never have to face American single-engine fighters over their homeland. That certainty was built on solid engineering principles. Every aircraft is a compromise between payload, range, and performance. Fighters needed to be fast and maneuverable to survive combat, which meant they required powerful engines that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Adding enough fuel capacity to extend range meant adding weight, which reduced performance and maneuverability. The physics seemed inescapable. Long-range escorts were impossible. But those calculations failed to account for one extraordinary aircraft and the engine that made it possible. The North American P-51 Mustang had been designed in response to a British requirement for a new fighter that could operate from British bases. The initial versions, powered by Allison engines, were good aircraft, but nothing revolutionary. They performed well at low and medium altitudes, but lost effectiveness above 15,000 feet, exactly where bomber escort missions needed fighters to operate. Everything changed when North American Aviation paired the Mustang's sleek airframe with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, manufactured under license in the United States by Packard. The Merlin was a masterpiece of engineering, a liquid-cooled V-12 engine that had already proven itself in the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane during the Battle of Britain. But the version installed in the P-51 featured something special, a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that allowed the engine to maintain full power at altitudes where other engines gasped for oxygen. The supercharger was the key. At high altitude, the air becomes so thin that conventional engines lose power dramatically. A supercharger compresses incoming air before it enters the combustion chambers, maintaining sea-level air density even at 30,000 feet. The two-stage system meant the air was compressed twice, first at low pressure and then at high pressure, allowing the Merlin to produce over 1,500 horsepower at altitudes where Japanese engines were struggling to generate half that power. But raw power alone wouldn't have given the Mustang its extraordinary range. That came from brilliant aerodynamic design. North American's engineers had created an airframe that used laminar flow wings, a revolutionary design where air flowed smoothly over the wing surface with minimal turbulence. This dramatically reduced drag compared to conventional wing designs. Less drag meant less power needed to maintain cruising speed, which meant less fuel consumption per mile traveled. The Mustang's internal fuel capacity was substantial, but the real breakthrough came with external drop tanks. These jettisonable fuel tanks could be mounted under the wings, dramatically extending the aircraft's range. When the Mustang approached combat, pilots could drop these external tanks, instantly shedding weight and drag to fight at full performance. With two massive drop tanks attached, a P-51D could fly over 1,500 miles, fight for 15 minutes, and still have enough fuel to return to base. This combination of efficient aerodynamics, powerful high-altitude performance, and massive fuel capacity created an aircraft that could do something no other fighter in the world could accomplish: escort heavy bombers from England to targets deep inside Germany, or from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, and still have the performance to dominate any defending fighters encountered along the way. While American factories were perfecting this remarkable machine, Japan's aviation industry was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and resource shortages. The Nakajima Ki-84, Hayate, known to the Allies as Frank, was an excellent fighter on paper, perhaps the best Japan produced during the war. It featured a powerful radial engine, heavy armament, and good speed and maneuverability. In perfect condition, with a well-trained pilot, it could challenge any Allied fighter on relatively equal terms. But perfect conditions had become impossible for Japan to maintain. The strategic bombing campaign had devastated Japanese industry, not just destroying factories, but severing the supply chains that linked raw materials to production facilities. Quality control collapsed as experienced workers were killed in air raids or drafted into military service. Replacement workers lacked the training and experience to maintain precision manufacturing standards. The results were catastrophic for Japanese pilots. Engines that should have lasted hundreds of hours were failing after 50. Parts manufactured at different facilities often didn't fit together properly, requiring field modifications that compromised structural integrity. Electrical systems malfunctioned, instruments failed, and control surfaces developed play that made precision flying dangerous. Pilots reported that aircraft delivered from the factory often required extensive repairs before they could be considered combat ready. But the most devastating shortage was fuel. Japan's access to petroleum had been systematically strangled by American submarines and air attacks on tanker shipping. The synthetic fuel programs that might have compensated for lost oil imports never reached sufficient production before facilities were destroyed by bombing. By early 1945, Japanese aircraft were often flying on fuel of such poor quality that engine failures became routine. The fuel problem created a vicious cycle: poor fuel, damaged engines, which reduced performance and reliability. This meant pilots needed more flight time to master their aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior. But fuel shortages meant training time was cut to the absolute minimum. Japanese pilots in the war's final year were being sent into combat with as little as 40 hours of total flight time, and many had never fired their guns except in actual combat. Compare this to American pilot training, where new fighter pilots received over 200 hours of flight time before being declared combat ready. They practiced aerial gunnery until shooting became instinctive, flew formation until coordinating with wingmen became second nature, and learned energy management and tactical doctrine that had been refined through years of combat experience. American pilots arrived at their units as skilled professionals. Japanese pilots arrived as barely trained sacrifices. The industrial gap extended beyond aircraft and pilot training. American logistics meant that spare parts arrived at forward bases in abundance. If an aircraft needed an engine change, mechanics simply removed the old one and bolted in a replacement that was guaranteed to be identical to the original. Standardized production meant every P-51 that rolled off the assembly line was functionally identical to every other P-51, and pilots could switch between aircraft with complete confidence. Japanese mechanics had no such luxury. Spare parts were scarce, and what parts did arrive often didn't match the aircraft they were supposed to repair. Engines were mix-matched between different variants. Propellers came from damaged aircraft being cannibalized for parts, and airframes were patched with whatever materials could be scrounged. Two Ki-84s sitting side by side might have completely different performance characteristics because their engines came from different production batches or ran on different grades of fuel. This industrial and logistical collapse meant that even when Japanese pilots had the courage to engage American formations, they were fighting from a position of overwhelming disadvantage. Their aircraft were often inferior through no fault of design, but simple inability to manufacture and maintain them to specification. Their training was inadequate because fuel shortages prevented proper instruction. Their numerical strength was an illusion because half the aircraft on any given airfield were likely unflyable due to maintenance issues or fuel shortages. And now, into this desperate situation, came an enemy that Japanese commanders had sworn could never threaten the homeland directly. The psychological impact of seeing P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo cannot be overstated. These weren't bombers that had to fly straight and level to hit their targets. These were fighters as fast and maneuverable as anything Japan could field, but with pilots who had hundreds of hours of training and aircraft that had been maintained to perfection by an industrial system that seemed capable of producing unlimited quantities of anything it needed. The first escort mission to Tokyo launched from Iwo Jima on April 7, 1945. Over 100 P-51 Mustangs took off in the pre-dawn darkness, formed up over the ocean, and set course for the Japanese capital. Their mission was simple: escort the B-29 bombers to their targets, destroy any Japanese fighters that attempted to interfere, and prove that American fighters could now operate freely over Japan itself. The flight required precise planning and execution. The Mustangs carried maximum fuel loads in their drop tanks, and pilots had been briefed extensively on fuel management procedures. They would cruise at optimum altitude and speed to minimize fuel consumption, dropping external tanks only when entering combat or if they became a liability. The margin for error was razor thin. If weather forced them off course, if they encountered stronger headwinds than forecast, if combat forced them to use emergency power for extended periods, some pilots might not have enough fuel to return to Iwo Jima. But the mission planners had done their calculations carefully, and the P-51's incredible efficiency meant there was enough reserve to handle contingencies. As the formation approached the Japanese coast, pilots armed their guns and began scanning for defending fighters. They knew the Japanese would be shocked to see them, but they also knew the desperate courage Japanese pilots had shown throughout the war. This would not be an easy victory. What happened over Tokyo that day represented a turning point, not just in tactical aviation, but in the psychological war being waged in the Pacific. The appearance of American fighters over the capital didn't just threaten military targets. It shattered the last illusion that Japanese territory remained inviolate. If American fighters could reach Tokyo, they could reach anywhere in Japan. No airfield was safe from strafing attack. No factory secure from bombing. No city protected from destruction. But here's what made the situation truly devastating for Japan. Something that went far beyond simple tactical defeat. The P-51's arrival over Tokyo triggered a complete reevaluation of Japanese defensive strategy that exposed a problem nobody had anticipated. When Japanese commanders realized American fighters could now escort bombers all the way to Japanese targets, they understood their entire homeland defense concept had become obsolete overnight. The plan had always been to inflict maximum casualties on unescorted bombers, making the American bombing campaign too expensive to sustain. With fighter escort now available, that strategy collapsed. But the Japanese military made a decision in response that would prove even more catastrophic than the tactical defeats they were suffering in the air. Unable to defeat American fighters in conventional combat, Japanese commanders accelerated their commitment to Toko tactics, what the Americans called kamikaze attacks. If Japanese pilots couldn't shoot down the bombers through superior flying skill, they would ram them deliberately, sacrificing their own lives to guarantee kills. This shift represented a complete abandonment of sustainable air defense. Conventional air combat, even when pilots were outmatched, allowed experienced aviators to survive, learn, and pass knowledge to new pilots. The suicide missions consumed Japan's remaining pilots at an unsustainable rate, killing experienced aviators who might have trained replacements and leaving Japan's Air Force weaker with each passing week. The appearance of the Mustangs over Tokyo didn't just defeat Japanese fighters in combat. It pushed Japanese leadership into a strategic dead end that accelerated the total collapse of Japan's air defenses. And there was another consequence that American intelligence only discovered after the war. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with the Mustangs over Tokyo began refusing to fly defensive missions against bomber raids, not from cowardice, but from devastating rationalization. They told their commanders that flying against escorted bomber formations was pointless suicide that wasted aircraft and pilots without achieving anything. Better to preserve their strength for the coming American invasion of the home islands, where they might at least die defending their families directly rather than being shot down over Tokyo by aircraft they had no chance of defeating. This collapse of pilot morale spread like a disease through Japanese fighter units. Squadron commanders found themselves unable to convince pilots to scramble when bomber raids approached. Mechanics began sabotaging aircraft to prevent missions that everyone knew were futile. The Japanese high command responded with increasingly harsh discipline, including executions for refusing orders, but terror tactics couldn't restore morale that had been broken by the simple reality of American air superiority. The specific engagement that convinced many Japanese pilots resistance was futile occurred on April 12th, just 5 days after the first Mustang escort mission. A force of over 150 P-51s accompanied B-29s targeting aircraft factories around Tokyo. Japanese commanders scrambled every fighter they could get into the air, over 50 aircraft from multiple airfields, in a coordinated attempt to overwhelm the American escorts through sheer numbers. The battle that developed was completely one-sided. American pilots flying aircraft that outperformed the Japanese fighters in every meaningful way tore through the defending formations with brutal efficiency. The P-51's 650 caliber machine guns, each loaded with over 400 rounds, gave American pilots tremendous sustained firepower. Japanese fighters typically carried heavy 20mm or 30mm cannons, devastating weapons when they hit, but with very limited ammunition. After firing a few brief bursts, Japanese pilots were essentially defenseless, forced to break off and return to base to rearm. The Americans had no such limitation. Their 50 caliber guns could fire for extended periods, and the convergence of 6 gun barrels meant that when American pilots achieved proper aim, their targets simply disintegrated under the concentrated fire. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes, but by the time Japanese fighters broke off and fled, over 25 defending aircraft had been destroyed. American losses totaled 3 aircraft, and 2 of those pilots were successfully rescued. More devastating than the raw numbers was what those losses meant for Japan's dwindling pool of experienced pilots. Among the dead was a lieutenant with over 30 combat victories, a flight commander who had fought since the invasion of China, and multiple pilots who served as instructors at fighter training schools. These men were irreplaceable, their knowledge and experience dying with them in the skies over Tokyo. The Americans who shot them down were often pilots on their first or second combat mission, benefiting from superior training, superior aircraft, and the accumulated tactical knowledge that American squadrons had developed over years of combat. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Japanese fighter pilot who survived the war, wrote in his diary about the psychological impact of that engagement. He described watching American Mustangs diving on Japanese formations with what he called casual arrogance, knowing they had the performance advantage to attack or disengage at will. He noted that American pilots seemed to hunt in coordinated pairs, one aircraft attacking while his wingman provided cover, executing textbook tactics that Japanese pilots had been taught but could no longer perform effectively because their aircraft and training were so degraded. Yoshida's diary revealed something that American intelligence hadn't fully grasped. It wasn't just that Japanese pilots were losing, it was that they knew exactly why they were losing and understood there was no solution within Japan's capability to implement. They needed better aircraft, but Japan's factories were being bombed into rubble. They needed better training, but there was no fuel for training flights. They needed better tactics, but tactics meant nothing when your aircraft was slower, less maneuverable at combat altitude, and armed with weapons that ran out of ammunition after seconds of firing. The appearance of P-51s over Tokyo represented perfect strategic timing. The Mustangs arrived exactly when Japan's air defenses had degraded to the point where they could be decisively defeated, but early enough that their psychological impact would hasten Japan's collapse. If the Mustangs had appeared a year earlier, Japanese industry might still have been capable of responding with improved aircraft and expanded pilot training. If they had appeared later, they would have simply been one more element in an already inevitable defeat. But arriving precisely when they did, the Mustangs became the symbol of everything Japan had lost. They proved that American industry could solve any technical challenge, that American logistics could support operations across thousands of miles of ocean, that American training could produce a virtually unlimited supply of skilled pilots, and that American strategic planning could identify and exploit Japanese weaknesses with devastating precision. The bomber crews who benefited from Mustang escort noticed the difference immediately. Interception rates dropped dramatically once fighters could accompany them all the way to target. When Japanese fighters did attack, they were quickly driven off by the escorts, allowing bombers to maintain formation and hit their targets with far greater accuracy. B-29 losses, which had been running at about 5% per mission against heavily defended targets, dropped to less than 1% once fighter escort became routine. This had strategic implications that went far beyond simply reducing casualties. Lower loss rates meant more bombers surviving to fly additional missions, multiplying their effectiveness. It meant experienced crews survived longer, passing their knowledge to new arrivals. It meant maintenance personnel weren't overwhelmed trying to repair battle-damaged aircraft. The entire bomber offensive became more efficient and sustainable precisely because the Mustangs eliminated the most dangerous threat to its continuation. For the Americans, the success of the Tokyo escort missions validated years of strategic planning and industrial development. The P-51 program had faced skepticism from some quarters, particularly from advocates who believed that bomber formations with heavy defensive armament could defend themselves without fighter escort. The European theater had already proven those arguments wrong, but the Pacific theater's vast distances had made some planners believe escort fighters would never be practical in that theater. The capture of Iwo Jima changed those calculations, but it still required an aircraft with extraordinary performance to make the escort mission feasible. That the P-51 Mustang could not only make the flight, but arrive over target with enough fuel reserve to fight effectively and still return safely to base represented a triumph of engineering and planning that few other nations could have achieved. The Merlin engine's reliability proved crucial to this success. Over hundreds of escort missions to Japan, engine failures were remarkably rare. Pilots trusted their Mustangs to bring them home across 700 miles of open ocean, and that trust was almost always justified. When engines did fail, it was usually due to combat damage rather than mechanical failure, and even damaged Mustangs often managed to limp back to Iwo Jima or ditch close enough to the island for rescue. The psychological warfare dimension of the Mustang's appearance went beyond simply demoralizing Japanese pilots. It sent a message to Japan's civilian population that the military government's assurances of ultimate victory were lies. People living in Tokyo could look up and see American fighters circling overhead with apparent impunity. The sight demolished official propaganda claiming that Japan's defenses remained strong and that the homeland would never be directly threatened. Japanese officials tried to suppress information about the Mustang's appearance, but in a city of millions, such censorship was impossible. Word spread rapidly that American fighters were now escorting the bombers, that Japanese interceptors were being shot down in large numbers, and that the military seemed helpless to stop the raids. This contributed to the growing sense among Japanese civilians that the war was lost and that continued resistance would only bring more destruction. The final accounting of the P-51's impact over Japan is impossible to calculate precisely, but certain facts are undeniable. From April through August of 1945, American fighters flew thousands of sorties over Japanese airspace. They destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and hundreds more on the ground during strafing attacks. They enabled the B-29 bombing campaign to achieve unprecedented accuracy and effectiveness. And they broke the morale of Japan's defending pilots to the point where the air defense system essentially ceased to function as an organized force. When Japan surrendered in August, one of the factors cited by military leaders was the complete loss of air superiority over the home islands. They understood that the coming American invasion would be supported by total air dominance, that Japanese ground forces would be subjected to continuous bombing and strafing with no possibility of air cover, and that resistance under such conditions would simply mean the destruction of Japanese cities and the slaughter of the population. The P-51 Mustang over Tokyo became the symbol of a war that had moved beyond any possibility of Japanese victory. The aircraft represented American industrial might, technological sophistication, and strategic vision that Japan simply could not match. For Japanese pilots who had entered the war believing in their moral and spiritual superiority over their Western opponents, the sight of Mustangs dominating the skies over their capital represented the complete collapse of that worldview. Flight Sergeant Totaro Shimezu survived the war and later wrote extensively about his experiences. His description of that first encounter with Mustangs over Tokyo remained vivid decades later. He wrote about the sick feeling in his stomach when he realized what he was seeing, about the moment of disbelief giving way to terror as the tactical situation became clear, and about the shame of breaking off his attack run and fleeing because he knew engagement would be suicide. But Shimezu also wrote something else, something that captured the deeper meaning of that encounter. He described how, after landing and climbing out of his cockpit, he stood on the airfield looking up at the sky where the contrails of American aircraft were still visible. He realized in that moment that the war was already over, that everything from this point forward was simply delay and destruction before the inevitable surrender. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo hadn't just been a tactical defeat. It had been the visible proof that Japan had lost the industrial, technological, and strategic war that had been unfolding behind the battle lines for years. The P-51 Mustang's greatest achievement wasn't measured in kill ratios or mission statistics, though those were impressive enough. Its greatest achievement was forcing the Japanese military to confront a reality they had been denying for months, that continued resistance was not a path to victory or even honorable defeat, but simple suicide that would destroy what remained of Japan without achieving anything meaningful. The Mustangs over Tokyo were the messenger that delivered that truth in a way that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Today, the P-51 Mustang is remembered as one of the finest fighter aircraft ever built, a perfect synthesis of aerodynamics, power plant, and armament that created a weapon system greater than the sum of its parts. But for those who flew them over Tokyo in the spring and summer of 1945, the Mustang was simply the tool that let them do an impossible job and return home safely to do it again the next day. And for the Japanese pilots who looked up that April morning and saw the impossible made real, the P-51 Mustang became the aircraft that broke not just their air defenses, but their certainty that courage and sacrifice could somehow overcome the crushing weight of American industrial power. In the end, the war in the Pacific was won not by any single weapon or battle, but by the accumulated effect of thousands of advantages in training, logistics, technology, and production capacity. But if you had to choose one aircraft that symbolized all those advantages, one weapon that proved the war's outcome with brutal clarity, It would be the silver Mustang with the white star on its wings flying freely over Tokyo, while Japanese defenders could only watch in helpless rage and despair. That was the aircraft that proved geography could no longer protect Japan, that technological superiority could extend operational range beyond what seemed possible, and that the Pacific Ocean had become not a defensive barrier, but simply another distance American aircraft could cross at will. The untouchable homeland had been touched, and nothing would ever be the same again.